Joined again here at this table by Luis Torro, who runs Colorado Ethics Watch, which is closing up shop after 11 years at the end of this year. So who's watching the ethics at that point?
Well, Kyle, we're hoping that we've already paved the way to have citizens help enforce ethics laws, because what's unique about Colorado is that ordinary citizens and private groups are expected to enforce campaign finance and ethics laws at their own expense. And so when we started in 2006, we could really say if Ethics Watch didn't do it, no one would. And that's really not true anymore. We've seen a record number of ethics complaints filed this year with the State Ethics Commission, and we didn't file any of them. And other people are also filing campaign finance complaints. We've kind of shown that it can be done. And so as far as that work goes, we haven't been filing much and other people have, so that's really our core area that we have to worry about being taken care of. And other than that, a lot of the work we've done in transparency can be done by the Freedom of Information Coalition. A lot of the legislative work we've done, we could look to Common Cause to continue to carry that torch. So I feel confident that the work we've done is not going to fall by the wayside.
I imagine, though, this do-it-yourself ethics policing system means that there's a lot of people out there with a lot of different axes to grind that are filing these ethical complaints. Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, it's not an ideal system. If we're up to me, it would be a system more like the federal, or, well, maybe not the federal because the FEC doesn't work, but state systems where there's a filter and a government agency accepts the complaints and then does its own investigation and decides which ones to pursue using prosecutorial discretion. I mean, here there is no prosecutorial discretion. If you file the complaint, you're in, at least as far as money in politics goes. So there are people with access to grind. I think the philosophy is by outsourcing the prosecution of the private sector, frankly, it saves the state money. We don't have the budget for a new ethics enforcement agency or a new campaign finance enforcement agency. So the Ethics Commission and the campaign finance enforcement system outsource that to the private sector.
So let's talk about your budget. You've said that one of the reasons why Colorado Ethics Watch is closing down is because the funding just wasn't there. So people are not interested in funding clean government anymore, or what?
Well, it's a couple of things. I mean, one, it's hard to make the case for as I was saying, that it's necessary that we be around, or else no one's going to file complaints. But the other part is, in the age of Trump, there's so much going on at the federal level. People look to Colorado and say, where's the big problem? What are we trying to address when there's so much going on federally? So the federal DC-based ethics groups are doing really well, and those of us out in the states, not so much.
You contrast local versus federal. I'd love for you to contrast government ethics in Colorado versus other states. I covered politics in New York before I came here, and everybody here is walking around with a halo compared to New York. What's your take?
Well, I agree with you about New York or Illinois, Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, to name a couple of states closer to us, have worse ethics problems than we do. We're not perfect. A lot of things have come up through the systems we have that show that everything's not on the up and up, but I think in general we're probably in the top half of states for good ethical behavior.
What do you consider to be Colorado Ethics Watch's biggest wins over the years, biggest impacts?
Well, I think the longest lasting impacts are going to be in the area of money in politics, where there was attempts by the then Secretary of State, Scott Gessler, to rewrite campaign finance rules to make it easier for groups not to have to disclose money. And those were done through formal rulemaking, and we took those to court in 2 lawsuits working with Colorado Common Cause, and all of those rules that we challenged were thrown out. So for example, ads that run in the last 60 days before an election or 30 days before a primary are called electioneering communications, and spending on that has to be disclosed whether or not the ads actually say vote for a candidate instead of saying call them and tell them something. So because of our win, those ads have to be disclosed regardless of whether they say vote for or not. And if they're just the so-called call and tell ads, they have to be disclosed anyway. So that's a permanent win. It can't be changed by a later Secretary of State. And that's why I think it's a long-lasting victory.
So you guys mixed it up very prominently with Scott Gessler, Republican Secretary of State, and you know that there are Republicans who looked at Colorado Ethics Watch and said, you guys existed to be a problem for Republicans, to make them spend money, and you let Dems slide.
Well, I'd say that is as far as money in politics goes, there is a difference, and there's definitely philosophical debate between those who think money in politics is generally bad and those who think that it's a kind of free expression. And so as far as is it progressive to want to have more disclosure in politics and less of the corrupting influence of money? Then yes, we're going to naturally clash with those who believe the other way, and that's exactly what happens. But if you look at some of the other work we've done with the CFOIC and working for transparency, we've worked hand in hand with the Independence Institute on open records laws, and those issues don't break down along liberal and conservative lines. And so I think that when it's been on transparency, we've been part of kind of the watchdog side versus government officials who might prefer to keep things quiet.
It was an easier case, I think, for conservatives to make years back when you guys were getting a lot of your funding from CREW, which is a group in D.C. that also does good government stuff, but is headed by a bunch of pretty prominent liberals. They, for years, CREW did, put out a list of the most corrupt politicians in Washington. You guys used to do it way back in Colorado. I don't remember this. Why'd you stop?
Mostly because we didn't have the same degree of corruption that they have in Washington. I mean, we're talking about 435 members of Congress, all of whom have to raise a ton of money, plus another 100 senators. That's really happy hunting grounds for corruption with all that money sloshing around in D.C. And here in Colorado, we only have 100 legislators, and they're relatively well behaved. So to try to gin up something that resembled the most corrupt list of D.C. started having to look at county commissioners and town council members who were doing things that just didn't seem quite so horrible. So that project didn't last very long. But they gave it up in D.C. too, I should mention.
If you had to come up with a mini most corrupt list in Colorado, could you come up with the names if you had to?
Probably not. I mean, we don't have those very high-profile, money in the freezer type politicians that you see in other states.
Very good. Luis Torro spent the better part of a decade looking out for politicians putting money in freezers and other things like that. Thank you for coming by. Colorado Ethics Watch closes up at the end of the year, but I hope you'll come back on this program.
Thanks for having me.